The Japanese pilots believed they had perfected a new aerial tactic, one designed to trap American fighters before they could react. High above the Pacific, a formation of Zeros prepared to test it against a lone American pilot. Yet within the quiet hum of his cockpit, he recognized something unusual, something that would shift the entire encounter before the trap could close. By mid-1943, the Pacific skies had become a shifting arena of adaptation. Each side learned from every previous encounter, and Japanese pilots, famous for their early war mastery of a Zero fighter, continued searching for new methods to maintain their edge. Their aircraft remained agile and deadly, yet the Americans had begun fielding more resilient machines, and experienced pilots no longer fell so easily into familiar traps. In response, several Japanese squadrons developed a technique known informally among their ranks as the descending veil. It relied on subtle misdirection. A pair of fighters would feign vulnerability or disarray, drawing an American pilot into what appeared to be a brief window for advantage. Meanwhile, additional Zeros waited at higher altitude, hidden just beyond the glare of the sun or inside the layered haze. Once the American fighter committed, the formation would collapse around him from multiple angles, giving the impression of a sudden ambush rather than a planned maneuver. For weeks, this approach had shown promise. In scattered encounters across island chains and convoy routes, several American pilots found themselves caught in tightening rings of coordinated Japanese fire. Reports circulated through American briefings, but the pattern remained elusive. The tactic relied on misdirection subtle enough to escape obvious detection, and those who encountered it often had little time to understand it fully before being forced to disengage or disappear into the ocean. Yet on a late afternoon patrol far from established bases, one American pilot would become the first to identify the faint traces of this new strategy before it unfolded. His aircraft, a rugged F-4F Wildcat still valued for its durability, carved a steady line across the Pacific sky. Below him lay shifting swells that reflected muted sunlight, and above stretched a haze that concealed distant shadows. The Wildcat was not the fastest fighter, but in experienced hands it could withstand punishment that would cripple lighter aircraft. When the first pair of Japanese fighters appeared, their movements seemed ordinary, a slow separation, an unexpected dip in altitude, a subtle suggestion of disorganization. Yet to the American pilot, these shifts felt deliberate. The sky carried a quiet tension he had sensed only in encounters where something unseen waited beyond the horizon. As he studied the scene, he realized that this formation was not fractured. It was preparing, and he chose not to play the role they expected. The Wildcat pilot had spent the morning tracing a wide reconnaissance arc over a sector of the Pacific known for sudden encounters. Clouds drifted lazily across the horizon in expanding sheets, offering alternating pockets of clarity and concealment. The ocean below rolled with long, rhythmic swells that shifted shades under the afternoon sun, producing a landscape both hypnotic and deceptive. It was within this environment that faint distortions often hinted at hidden aircraft, though today the early patrol remained uneventful. As he turned toward the second leg of his assigned route, the pilot listened to the steady hum of the engine and monitored the subtle variations in temperature and manifold pressure that indicated the machine's health. The Wildcat responded reliably, its controls firm yet familiar. Though older than newer American fighters entering service, it possessed qualities that seasoned pilots valued: robust armor, consistent handling, and the ability to absorb damage without catastrophic failure. The pilot scanned the horizon frequently, alternating between wide sweeps and focused examinations of areas where sunlight met haze. It was during one of these observations that he noticed two distant shapes moving with unusual coordination. At first glance, they seemed to represent a pair of Zeros engaged in their usual patrol behavior. Their separation was slight, their altitude consistent, and their trajectory seemingly parallel to his own. As he approached cautiously, their behavior shifted. 1-0 drifted downward several hundred feet, as though experiencing a minor mechanical issue or turbulence. The second followed at a slower pace, retaining a position that suggested either mild concern or a need to maintain visual contact. These small changes appeared insignificant, yet the pilot sensed an intentional rhythm beneath them. Rather than spiraling away or executing sharp turns typical of disorganized formations, they descended in extended arcs that preserved control and spacing. Years of experience had taught him that true disorder rarely looked this tidy. Mechanical failures often created erratic patterns, and inexperienced pilots displayed hesitation that translated into unsteady flight paths. Here, however, the movement reflected quiet confidence, an attempt to communicate vulnerability without actually being vulnerable. He remained at altitude, resisting the instinct to dive for an early advantage. Patience, he knew, could reveal more than aggression. As he circled cautiously, his eyes shifted upward, examining the space where glare obscured finer details. The haze held faint shadows, too faint to identify, yet too structured to dismiss. He recognized the possibility that additional fighters lurked above, waiting for him to commit. His suspicions strengthened when the lower zero adjusted its bank angle in a controlled but conspicuous fashion. The gesture appeared careless, almost staged, as though meant to suggest the pilot was occupied with troubleshooting. The trailing zero mirrored the change after a delay that felt intentionally timed. At that moment, the Wildcat pilot understood that the pair desired his approach. Their spacing offered a tempting opening. A quick dive could place him in position to isolate the lower aircraft before the second could intervene. It was a tactic that many Americans had successfully executed earlier in the war. Yet he refrained. The ocean below reflected bright bands of light that masked subtle aerial shapes, and he recognized the older Japanese technique of using sun glare to conceal supporting fighters. He shifted his altitude slightly, not enough to reveal suspicion, but enough to disrupt any clean attack angle the Japanese formation intended to exploit. The Wildcat rolled gently, allowing him to maintain visual coverage of the descending pair while also preparing for threats from above. His movements were minimal, deliberate, and shaped by an understanding that the first pilot to reveal intent often ceded initiative. The Japanese fighters continued their subtle performance, but the American remained just beyond the range where their tactic could unfold effectively. The trap was set, yet he refused to step inside. The stage of the encounter had been established, and the unseen components of the Japanese tactic were beginning to stir into motion. As the American pilot maintained altitude, the Japanese formation began adjusting its behavior to provoke a reaction. The two lower zeros executed turns that seemed increasingly careless, banking slightly too steeply or drifting marginally out of alignment. These discrepancies mimicked the movements of pilots inexperienced in coordinating with one another or struggling with minor mechanical issues. To an unwary observer, such signs invited exploitation. To the American, they served as early warnings. He shifted his attention to the layered haze above, where faint silhouettes began to emerge. At first, they appeared as subtle gradients, barely perceptible against the backlit cloud cover. Yet as the sun dipped a fraction lower, the shapes resolved into clearer outlines. 3 additional zeros hovered in a holding pattern, spaced evenly in a manner that suggested deliberate placement rather than coincidence. Their altitude advantage, combined with the downward pull of gravity during attack dives, positioned them ideally to collapse upon any pilot who committed prematurely to an engagement below. The pilot recognized the intention, a stage vulnerability designed to bait an adversary into a confined zone where escape routes diminished sharply. Once entrapped, an American fighter would find itself overwhelmed by speed, angle, and crossfire generated by attackers with superior positioning. Rather than approaching the lower fighters, he drifted subtly to the west, altering his altitude in increments small enough to avoid signaling aggression. His movements resembled those of a pilot adjusting for crosswinds rather than preparing for combat. The Japanese observers above likely interpreted this as hesitation, potentially confirming their belief that the tactic was working. Through his canopy glass, reflections shimmered across the instrument panel. He steadied his breathing, assessing fuel reserves and engine response. The Wildcat was not designed to outrun a Zero, but its durability and controlled dive characteristics provided opportunities when employed with foresight. The Japanese advantage had always been agility paired with coordinated attacks. Yet coordination depended on prediction, on the assumption that an opponent would behave as expected. He continued to drift westward, placing the sun at a different angle relative to his position. This adjustment disrupted the Japanese pilot's ability to conceal themselves effectively. One of the higher Zeros, realizing its silhouette had become more visible, shifted quickly back into the haze. The rapid movement confirmed what the American had suspected. The formation above was actively shaping the engagement, not merely patrolling. With the positions now clearer, he began planning his response. The key to countering a trap was to force the adversary to commit prematurely. If he could generate uncertainty within the Japanese formation, their coordinated timing would deteriorate. The descending veil tactic relied heavily on synchronized entry from multiple angles. Any deviation could unravel the advantage. He gently increased throttle, not to engage directly, but to widen the distance between himself and the lower pair. The Zeros responded immediately, adjusting their positions to maintain the illusion of vulnerability. Their eagerness confirmed the reliance on proximity to trigger the trap. Above, the three concealed fighters tightened their formation, readying for a dive. This premature adjustment allowed the American to read their intentions more clearly. The perfect moment had not yet arrived for them, yet they believed it soon would. Instead of granting that moment, the American pilot executed a controlled climb. The adjustment was subtle, carried out with such measured precision that the lower Zeros may have interpreted it as an attempt to break contact or gain observational advantage. Yet as he ascended, he angled the Wildcat toward the thinner portion of the haze, where the altitude advantage of the hidden Zeros diminished. The Japanese tactic depended on compressed vertical space. By expanding that space, he disrupted the geometry of their impending attack. The unseen formation began to descend. The Japanese pilots above recognized that the Americans' climb threatened to stretch the carefully shaped geometry of their arrangement. If he reached an altitude too close to theirs, the advantage granted by a downward attack angle would lessen significantly. Thus, they initiated the early stages of their descent, adjusting throttle and pitch in a coordinated motion meant to preserve the tactical design. The American noted the shift instantly. The higher Zeros moved not with the subtlety of earlier positioning, but with an urgency that suggested commitment. Their wings glinted briefly through the haze as they realigned for attack. The two lower fighters, still maintaining the appearance of disordered flight, altered their trajectories as well, creating a lattice of intersecting paths intended to compress the Wildcat into the center of the unfolding trap. Yet by climbing when he did, the American had forced the Japanese formation to initiate their sequence earlier than planned. The distances between them no longer reflected the ideal spacing for the tactic. The upper fighters were slightly too far east, the lower fighters slightly too far south, and the Wildcat positioned itself at an altitude that complicated the intended crossfire. Still, the Japanese pilots proceeded. They believed the confrontation remained theirs to control, and their confidence in the descending veil pushed them forward. The first zero dove from above, cutting through the haze with a shallow angle that aimed to pressure the American into banking right. At the same moment, the lower left zero attempted a climb, seeking to converge upon the predicted movement. The American resisted both impulses. Instead of banking right, he executed a controlled roll to the left, dropping altitude in a manner that exploited the Wildcat's sturdy airframe. The sudden shift forced the diving zero to adjust its trajectory sharply, eroding the advantage of its initial approach. The second high-altitude zero entered its dive prematurely, misjudging the American's altered position. Its path intersected the wake turbulence left by the first attacker, creating mild instability that further disrupted coordination. The lower pair attempted to compensate by tightening their turn, yet their spacing, originally designed for a different angle, no longer placed them in optimal firing position. Within the cockpit, the American pilot maintained unwavering focus. His maneuvers were neither frantic nor rushed. He recognized that outcome hinged not on speed, but on composure. When the third zero from above initiated its approach, he angled the Wildcat downward, using gravity to increase acceleration and widen the distance between attackers. The Wildcat's heavier frame granted him stability during high-speed dives that often proved challenging for the lighter zero. Gunfire erupted across the sky, tracers stitching the air around him. The Wildcat shuddered under the pressure of evasive maneuvers. Yet the American pressed through the dive, forcing the attackers to overtake him or alter their approach angles. 1-0 overshot, losing its alignment entirely. Another attempted to match the dive, but drifted dangerously close to the lower pair, forcing a separation that widened coordination gaps. The American pulled out of the dive in a sweeping arc, rolling upward to position himself behind the disoriented lower pair. His timing was exact. The nearest zero, startled by the sudden inversion of positions, attempted to climb sharply. The maneuver exposed its underside, and the Wildcat pilot lined up a clean shot. He fired a steady burst, controlled, deliberate. The round struck the Zero's wing root, sending it into a spiraling descent that carried it away from the formation. The remaining fighters recoiled. Their tactic, designed to trap, had been broken. Above, the two remaining high-altitude Zeros circled uncertainly, adjusting their formation to regain advantage. Yet the American had already shown he understood their pattern. Their confidence wavered as the realization spread among them. The descending veil worked only when the opponent entered willingly. This one had refused. The sudden loss of 1-0 unsettled the formation in ways that extended beyond physical positioning. Japanese pilots valued coordinated execution, and their tactics relied heavily on mutual timing. When one element fractured, the rest bore the burden of adaptation. The American pilot sensed this hesitation and used it to reshape the flow of the engagement. He maintained altitude gained from the recovery of his previous dive, leveling out at a position nearly parallel with the highest remaining zero. The sunlight, refracted through the thinning haze, illuminated both aircraft as they entered a moment of near stillness before the next exchange. The Wildcat's engine rumbled with steady confidence, offering the pilot reassurance as he prepared for the next maneuver. The highest zero attempted a measured descent, perhaps seeking to reestablish the geometry of the tactic. Yet without full formation support, its angle lacked the cohesion necessary to trap the American. The Wildcat pilot executed a shallow climb, forcing the zero to adjust prematurely. Subtle though it was, the adjustment revealed the pilot's hesitancy. The American recognized the opportunity. He banked left, aligning himself momentarily on an intersecting path. The Zero attempted a roll to evade the convergence, but the maneuver revealed its position to the Wildcat's guns. The American fired another disciplined burst, tracking the Zero's motion through the sight. Tracer rounds struck the fuselage, and the aircraft shuddered as smoke trailed from its engine. Though not destroyed, the Zero broke away, descending rapidly to escape further engagement. Only two Zeros remained in proximity, both of which approached with caution previously absent from their movements. Their earlier confidence, anchored in the strength of their coordinated tactic, had dissolved. Now, they faced a pilot who not only resisted the trap, but manipulated it to his advantage. They repositioned in a wide arc, attempting to control the horizontal plane. The American responded by shifting vertically, disrupting their attempts to shape the engagement. The differences between the aircraft became clear. The Zero excelled in tight turns and rapid adjustments, while the Wildcat thrived in durability and stability through dives and high-speed maneuvers. By elevating the vertical component of the fight, the American forced the Zeros into a less favorable arena. The pilot pulled the Wildcat upward in a sharp climb, placing himself briefly above the Japanese fighters. From this vantage, he studied their approach pattern. The lead Zero attempted a vertical roll, likely hoping to lure him downward into a chase that would expose him to the wingman. It was a revised tactic, less coordinated, but still reliant on deception. He did not fall for it. Instead, he used the energy gained from the climb to execute a rapid descent at an oblique angle. The movement surprised both Japanese pilots, who had expected him to commit downward only after entering their trap zone. By descending early and at an unexpected vector, he forced them to scatter. One Zero veered right, the other climbing left. Their separation created a fleeting moment where neither held advantage. The American capitalized instantly, rolling into position behind the lower fighter. The Zero banked sharply, exploiting its superior turn radius. Yet the Wildcat pilot anticipated the maneuver, adjusting throttle and angle to maintain pursuit long enough to force the Zero into continued evasive motion. The pressure mounted. The Japanese pilot struggled to regain control of the engagement. He executed a steep climb in an attempt to shake the Wildcat, but the maneuver drained critical speed. The Americans seized the opening, delivering a burst that clipped the Zero's tail assembly. Smoke trailed behind as the fighter fell away, leaving only one opponent remaining. The final Zero circled at a distance, perhaps reassessing the engagement entirely. The tactic had failed, the formation scattered, and the American pilot had demonstrated an understanding of their movements that surpassed expectation. The initiative now belonged to him. The last Zero circled cautiously, maintaining a wide berth as it evaluated the Wildcat's new position. The American pilot stabilized his altitude, letting the faint hum of the engine settle into a durable rhythm. The Pacific stretched beneath him in vast, undulating patterns, reflecting soft light that painted the encounter with subdued intensity. He sensed the Japanese pilot's hesitancy. The earlier confidence that accompanied the elaborate tactic had evaporated. The final Zero began a slow, deliberate approach. Its pilot maintained altitude, avoiding the overly aggressive dive angles that had doomed previous attempts. The two aircraft drew nearer in a silent, tense convergence defined not by speed, but by calculation. At this stage, both pilots understood that a single misstep could determine the outcome. The American made the first subtle adjustment. He shifted slightly to the left, presenting a profile that suggested an attempt to gain an advantageous firing position. The Japanese pilot responded immediately, banking right to counter the perceived threat. Yet the American had anticipated this reaction. Rather than tightening his turn, he rolled into a shallow dive, exploiting the Wildcat's strong downward stability. The maneuver placed him beneath the Zero, where its guns could not reach effectively. The Zero's pilot realized the danger and attempted to climb sharply to regain altitude. Yet the maneuver cost him momentum. The American followed, rising in a smooth arc that kept him aligned with the Zero's underside. As he ascended, he maintained distance just wide enough to avoid collision while remaining within firing range. The Japanese pilot executed a desperate defensive role, trying to force the Wildcat into an overshoot. However, the American matched the movement, maintaining his position with calm precision. He understood that the Zero's strength lay in tight maneuvers, and he refused to be drawn into a turning contest. Instead, he waited for the roll to complete, leveling his aircraft at the exact moment the Zero settled into a climb. In that instant, the opening appeared. The American's guns lined up with the Zero's fuselage. He fired a steady, controlled burst. Tracer rounds connected with the aircraft's right side, and the Zero jolted violently. Smoke streamed from its engine as the pilot attempted to maintain control. For several seconds, the aircraft wavered, struggling to stabilize. Then it dipped into a downward spiral, disappearing beneath the haze. Silence returned to the sky. The American pilot leveled his Wildcat, breathing deeply as the tension slowly dissolved. The Pacific stretched before him, wide and serene, as though unaware of the struggle that had just unfolded above its surface. He checked instruments, fuel gauges, and engine temperature, ensuring the aircraft remained capable for the return flight. He understood what had transpired. He had not simply outmaneuvered individual pilots, but dismantled a coordinated tactic designed specifically to trap fighters like his. By recognizing the pattern early, forcing premature execution, and manipulating the geometry of the engagement, he had turned a carefully crafted ambush into a fragmented skirmish. As he began the long journey back toward his carrier, the sky remained quiet. Nothing pursued him. Nothing threatened him. The tactic that once promised Japanese squadrons a renewed advantage had unraveled in the hands of a pilot who refused to be predictable. When the Wildcat finally approached its carrier group, the fading sunlight cast long reflections across the water. The pilot lined up for approach, feeling the weight of fatigue settle into his arms. Yet beneath that exhaustion lay a sense of clarity rarely achieved in aerial combat. He had not only survived an encounter meant to overwhelm him, but had learned something vital, knowledge that would influence far more than his own missions. After landing, he walked across the deck with the composed steps of someone processing an experience still unfolding in his thoughts. As he recounted the engagement to his squadron, each detail captured their attention. The deliberate descent of the lower Zeros, the concealed formation above, the coordinated timing. All these components revealed a tactic designed with precision. Yet by identifying small inconsistencies early and refusing to follow assumed patterns, he had dismantled it entirely. Intelligence officers documented his account meticulously. The description provided the first comprehensive understanding of the descending veil, a tactic that had puzzled American pilots during recent unexplained losses. His insights transformed scattered rumors into a recognizable pattern, one that could now be taught, briefed, and countered. Future patrols adopted new scanning practices, paying closer attention to subtle spacing and altitude differences within Japanese formations. Reports later surfaced confirming that Japanese pilots were surprised by how quickly the tactic lost effectiveness. They had expected it to create overwhelming pressure, yet instead it became a liability when opponents understood its geometry. The American pilots' engagement showed that discipline, patience, and the refusal to engage impulsively could render the tactic not only ineffective but dangerous for those attempting it. In the broader narrative of the Pacific War, This encounter symbolized a shift that had been emerging slowly. Early war dominance through agility and coordinated misdirection met increasing resistance as American pilots gained experience and aircraft improved. What once worked effortlessly now required adaptation, and even the most carefully designed traps risk collapse when faced with opponents who learned from every encounter. The Wildcat pilot's return marked more than survival. It represented a moment where understanding triumphed over deception, where one measured decision altered the trajectory of an entire tactic. His calm persistence in the face of an unfolding trap demonstrated that victory in the Pacific skies did not belong solely to the fastest aircraft, but to those who saw beyond the patterns others assumed unbreakable. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.